Hi, I'm speedlag. I'm a motion designer and illustrator. Today I'm starting what I hope will be a series of tutorials on some of my favorite rigging techniques. So follow me on Instagram at speedlag or subscribe to my YouTube or Vimeo where you'll see more of these along with my own work. Today what we'll be covering is an advanced rigging technique in After Effects that is completely free. It's been one of my most popular tutorial requests and it's the inspiration for this series. We will be using a third-party plugin, and that's DuIK Bassel from Rainbox. You can find it on their site if you don't already have it, where yes, it is free. That said, I would highly encourage you to donate to them or become a Patreon, because this plugin is extremely useful beyond what we'll cover. I use it all the time and they're worth supporting. Alright, before we begin, I want to show this illustration that I put together. This is really just to show the sort of effect that we're going to be going for. At the top here, I have a controller, which is it's technically a DuIK Connector. They just come in many different forms, so we will be using the slider for this tutorial. And as you move the slider back and forth, you can see that it's controlling a number of elements. I have them shaded different tones, blue on one side, orange on the other, so that you can see when layers shift to the front or the back. We're controlling position, path, and opacity with this one controller. This is also a pretty typical center of gravity controller, and it works really well with that. All right, so I am going to get started in a 1080 by 1080 square composition. None of this really matters. There's nothing that we will be controlling that is specifically based on the size of the composition. This is just the one that I'm working in. It's Instagram size. It's something I'm pretty comfortable with. I'll also be working at 12 frames a second. You can work at any frames per second you choose. I like 12 frames per second because it looks really good with animation. So I'll hit OK. And the first thing I will be doing is getting my legs set up. So this is just the first part of the tutorial. This really doesn't deal with the connector, but it's just a little bit of setup so that when we implement the connector or the hip controller, we will have some of the controls that we will need ready to go. So I am going to call this geom left underscore leg. And then I'm going to bring in, just for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to be using a beam effector as if it's a thigh. So I'm going to change some of these. We'll go 50% in the time, length 100%. Starting thickness, we'll just change that to 100 for now. We'll be changing that later. Softness 0, and then I will change these colors to white. So now I have kind of a leg, at least kind of a thigh. So that's the knee. This will be the hip. I'll just kind of set that up like that. What do I call this? The left leg. Okay, so I like to, whenever I name layers, I like to name layers based on the perspective of the character that we're rigging. So if this is a character that is facing us, this will be their left leg, which means it will actually be on our right. It just helps me, especially when we're dealing with rotation, because the left and the right will change depending on the character's rotation. So that's something to keep in mind, and it's something that I try to be pretty consistent about. It helps me. It helps any animators that might be working with the rigs that I create. So the first thing we'll want to do is give ourselves some control over these little points right here, because right now if I want to move the leg, if I click off of it, I can't just grab it and move it. I have to go to the effect, I have to select it and then move that, and that's a big pain in the butt. So let me drop down the effect, and we're going to put some DuIK bones on here. I think bones are one of the best things that DuIK gives us. It's one of the best controls. Anything that has position data can be controlled by one of these bones, and you'll see here in a moment how we'll be using it. So switch over to, in DuIK Bassel, you will be under the rigging tab. And then inside here, there's create structures where there's a lot of IK information. There's controllers on the right. And in the middle, we have some various miscellaneous properties, one of which is add bones. So go ahead and just hit the button and it's going to do some stuff. Yours might look more like push pins. I've changed mine so that they just look really tiny. It just is less distracting for me. They do the same thing. It's just how they look. And you'll see that they have shown up down here as solids. And now if I deselect I can even lock my leg layer. I can now drag that bone and move it around and now control its position data just like it would any other layer. It has all of the transform information that you would want. And most importantly, we have position data, which is really cool. So another control that I want to give just for ease later on is a slider control. So I'm going to hit this button right here. I'm going to get a little slider. And then from this handle, we're going to change some information. So let's change this to, let's see, this is the left side. So let's make the left side blue. I also like to color code my side. So this is the left geometry. So let's go ahead and just change this to blue. I have a couple different blues and a couple different oranges. So let's do that, keep them the same. And yeah, grab that blue, there we go. And then I will change this controller to some kind of blue as well. So this is not connected to anything. It's just a little solid circle right now. That's just pretty much just a piece of artwork right now. And so we will connect it to this. In the beam effect, there is a starting thickness, and then there's an ending thickness. So I'm going to change the ending thickness actually to 150, and we're going to change that starting thickness based on this slider's information. Okay, so let me drop down this effect, and let me also open up the position data on here, and I'm going to alt click on starting thickness, or command click, I think. Maybe it's control click on a Mac. And then connect it to the position there. So now that position, it's in the center, so it's going to turn that thickness to 0. So if we scale that up, you can see that now we're controlling that effect on the beam. I just want to magnify that, so I'm just going to multiply by, let's say, 2. So that's just in this expression down here, I just do a little asterisk for times, and then 3. So now it is multiplying by 3, and that is a pretty good look right there. All right, so let's do a little bit of cleanup. So I'm going to grab that first bone, and I'm actually going to name this now B for bone. I will take off that geometry. B, left leg, and then we will change this to hip. And then I'll copy this, select this bottom bone right here, we'll paste and call this knee. So bone, left leg, knee. And the next thing I'm going to do is I kind of like to give myself controls that aren't shape layers. So I'm just going to hit over here on DuIK Bassel. See, we're under the controller tab. I'm going to hit this null object right here. I just like those for controls. And we get a little blue. We'll change this to light blue controller. Move that to the top. And so here we have control left leg, hip. And we'll grab this, move it down, and I will connect that or parent it to our controller so now it follows it around, which is nice. And then I'll grab that hip bone and I will also connect that to the controller so it follows along too. So we have now created our left leg. And then that's just there. I'm probably just going to lock that for now. And then these, I will shy guy, hit that little shy guy layer, lock them, and then hit the shy guy. So that just cleans up how it looks down here. I'll do the same with the geometry. And yeah, we keep that there for now. All right, so I'm going to go through and do this all again on the other side, and then I will meet you guys there. All right, so now we're gonna get into the really fun stuff. There's just a little bit of housekeeping things that I need to do, and then we will begin connecting these controllers or whatever IK rig that you have at this point to that waist slider controller. So I like to be as precise as possible when I'm starting a rig. So I wanna make sure that these hip controllers are at the same Y level, which they should be because of this ruler. And then I also want to make sure that they are mirrored directly from the center point of my composition. So since my composition is 1080 wide, I'm going to just subtract from the outer edge till I have the basic look that I want. So let's start with the left hip over here, make sure I have the position, and then I'm going to do 1080 and then minus 400. So this way the actual distance from each other isn't so arbitrary as it's been before. So let me hit position on the right one. And since it'll just be counting over from the 0 over here, I will just do 400. So plus 400 on this side, minus 400 from the width, which is 1080 on this side. And then I will do the same thing with the knees. So we'll do this left knee, hit the X position, go 1080 minus 350. And so this way it'll be actually pointed out a little bit. So I'm doing this with the knees. If you have an IK where there's a hip, a knee, and then the foot, you would just be doing this with the foot. And actually it's not as necessary down here because we actually won't be messing with these positions. I just like to do it because it's cleaner this way. So we'll just do this really quick. We'll do 350 from there. All right. And then I want to make sure that all of my layers down here are where I need them to be. So I'm going to go ahead and lock my knees, or you can lock your feet if you're dealing with that. Everything down here is shy guide, and I also have them stacked. So the geometry is down here at the bottom, the bones are next. Then I have the slider layers that I really won't be touching locked. And then I have all the controllers at the very top. Just looks a little bit better that way. And then I'll shy guide that. And here we go. This is where the magic really starts taking place. So to set up your controller, you will want to hit if you have a numpad, it's just make sure you're deselected of any layer and hit the asterisk button. If you don't have a numpad, you can just drag this little thing right here and then edit that. I'll delete this now. And we will double click that marker we just made at the very beginning, and we will call this left. And then you can go to any point. I like to do 10 frames in. So I just, while I was on frame 0, hit Shift Control and then right. That'll take me 10 frames over. And then I'm going to hit the asterisk again. We'll double click that and then call this center. And then Shift Control right button. Hit the asterisk again, double click, and then we will call this right. So this is just where we're going to set our keys. We have a center for the center, which is pretty much where we are right now. a left for when the slider is to the left, and then a right for when the slider is to the right. So I will grab the hip layers, hit position, or sorry, P for position, and then we will set some keys here. And then I will grab the scale, and then I will hit P for position, and I will hit and make some keyframes there too. So no animation, of course. And then we will go to frame 0, and then we're going to set our first bit of animation. So this is, if we were to slide the slider to the left, the animation that we would want there. So imagine right now that this left, or sorry, that's the right hip, that the left hip is now in front and the right hip is now in back. So we'll also want to not just move the position, but we'll also want to change the scale. So we'll just move this to something that looks nice, that looks good. It's a good amount of change there. And then we will do the even amount on the back with the hip that's in the back. So now you see that we have a little bit of fake rotation. No actual rotation happening, just faked. So perspective change on the hip in the back and perspective change on the hip in the front. Right now there's nothing overlapping. And then we're going to do the same thing with the right. So if the slider were to move to the right, everything would do the opposite that it did before. So now the right hip will move to the front. So we'll say, let's see, what number did we do? We did 68. So let's just do the same here. So we'll change that to 68. And then the bottom one, or the one in the back, will go smaller to 48. So there we go. Nice little bit of fake rotation right there. Now I like to start getting into animation as quickly as possible. So we're actually going to hook up these properties that we just made here, these keyframes, to the main controller, the main hip controller. So if you go over here in the DuIK rigging section, under the links and constraints tab, there's the connector. We're going to hit this little circle over here. And we will create a slider controller. So it's right here in the center of our composition. We will move it up just by grabbing the slider. And let's change this by hitting the slider at the top. We will drop down this in the effects to just change the color so that it's something that we can see against this background. And now you will grab the slider, just the little knob, hit P to get position, and you will select that property. And then over here in DuIK, you will select a master property. That'll change some of these values, and then we will manually change in the minimum to -150, and then the maximum to 150. Next thing we'll do is drag and select all of our keyframes and hit connect to properties. That's going to make this kind of cute little icon right here that we will, let's get rid of that. We'll move this off to the side, lock it, make it go away. And now if we start moving this knob around, we'll see that we are getting some movement. It's moving through the keyframes that we connected to it. It's not quite there yet. We want to change the size of some things. So let's change the slider to 300%, just so it's bigger, and then up the scale of that knob to something obnoxious, and then turn it green. So now when we drag it and go all the way to one end, it gets to the end of our keyframes, and then all the way to the other end, it does the same. So that's just going between that minimum and maximum value that we made. That can change depending on what you want that controller to look like. This is just, I think, a good scale for this waist controller. So we're seeing it come together pretty quickly now. The next thing we need to do is duplicate the work that we did here so that we can have a leg that comes to the front, and then when it goes to the back, it will actually switch to a different layer that's lower in the hierarchy. So let's do that next. And it's actually pretty easy. If you're following along with me, all we'll have to do is duplicate this geometry layer to continue going. So we're actually going to name these first. So if we have geometry right leg, we will add an additional title to it, which we'll just call this front. And then we will do that with the left leg as well. Oh, all capitals. If you are dealing with a different IK setup, I'm sure you could probably just do the same thing. It's really just changing, it's really just having a replacement piece to go to. So I'm now going to duplicate these and then change the duplicates to back. And move those below. So now they're literally behind the other layers. So if we move, we'll lock these. If I'm moving this slider, they're still there. Here's the new ones, the back ones. They're still there, just like the other layers. They're connected because they are connected via expressions to those bones that we already made. So the bones are still driving this animation, which is pretty neat. Unsolo everything. And now the only thing that we have to do is tell the front legs to disappear when they need to be in the back. So I'll go and highlight all these. Let's hit T for transparency. And we will turn them all at 100% in the middle. So let's just create a keyframe there. And now we will slide, temporarily lock that. We will slide this over to the left just so that we can see that what we need to do. So right now we've moved it to the left. So that means that the left leg is in the front. So we will have the left leg while it is in the front at 100% opacity, turn that, make a keyframe there. And then the front leg for the right is not in the front, so we will change that to 0. Oh, sorry about that. So we will change that to 0. And then we will do the exact opposite for the back layers. So the right back leg is at 100% opacity, and the left leg, which is not in the back, will be at 0. And I'm going to just change, the colors of these legs to make it a little bit clearer what's happening. So let's change the front to kind of a magenta there. I'll grab that same one. And put it on the front leg. So now when I move that slider, we could see it all the way through. Right now it's 100% opacity, the left front leg the whole time, so it's not going to look any different. So let's go to the right and do that. So now that we've moved it to the right hip is in front. So we will make sure that that is on. We will see the left leg is no longer in front, so we'll change that to 0. The right leg is not in the back, so we'll change that to 0. And the left leg is in the front, or the left leg is in the back, so we will put that to 100%. And it's still not connected to this slider, so nothing's going to happen. But what I can do is simulate it by just making a keyframe here, and then going to -150 over here. So now if we move through the timeline, you can see how the layers are turning on and off. This is what's going to really help amplify that three-dimensional feel. So this way you can have different artwork on those layers. On my example, I had a little bit of a shadow pass in there. This is where you just are giving yourself that sort of control and freedom to do, well, whatever you want to do. It's whatever you want to spend the time hooking up to this controller. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and do that. We don't need to change. We don't need to really worry about these keyframes. We will just connect it. So DuIK, it's still referencing the position property of that slider right now. So all we have to do is highlight our new keyframes and hit connect to properties. So now I can get rid of those keyframes, the slider position, and when I slide through it, you will see that it is changing. How cool is that? A little trick that I do, because right now it's slowly fading, and you might want it to have a little bit more of a quicker reaction than that. You might want it to happen just on a single frame. There is a trick that I do where instead of using linear keyframes down here, I actually use hold frames. The controller is a pretty cool tool that anything that happens in the timeline from the very first keyframe to the very last keyframe is controlled by that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the left, the center, and the right. You can put keyframes in between. So what we're actually going to do is add an additional keyframe for the opacity that will make it much more abrupt of a change instead of something linear. So we'll look at, we'll start here in the center. So this layer is, actually let me just disconnect these so I can see a little bit more what's going on. Disconnect all of those. And we will change all of these. We'll select them all and hold keyframes. So the only problem with changing the hold keyframes is they won't change to the property we want it to be until they hit them in the timeline. So this is much too late for it to flip to the back side. So what we'll actually do is put an additional keyframe. See, those two are changing, right? We'll put an additional keyframe right here on this side of center, and we will make that, don't know why I keep doing that. We will make this 0, and then this 0. So now instead of changing 0 when they hit that very last point, they'll actually hit 0 immediately on this side of center, and then hold that until the end. And we have to keep these frames over here just because that's how the connector tool wants to work. So we'll do the same thing on this side for the other pieces of geometry. So we will, you can even just copy and paste that outside keyframe. So now you see that it changes a lot more abruptly. And if I reconnect these, you don't actually have to connect it to the controller again. You just grab that slider and then move it, and you'll see that it flips instantly. And that becomes a very useful tool with a lot of the rotation rigs that I end up making. And I'll just quickly recolor the geometry for clarity in this next section. So the hard part's done. The next thing we just need to do is figure out how we will connect this to the rest of the rig. So let me clear up the layers down here. Just shy guy that. We will lock the scale for those. We won't be needing those, at least for now. I'm going to move this controller up above where our waistline is probably going to be. And I'll lock that. Great. So we're going to draw the art directly here in After Effects. Sometimes you might have created your art in a different program like Adobe Illustrator and then brought it in here. This really just depends on the sort of character that you're working with. Just to show it today, I will be illustrating it directly in here, even though usually I would probably bring in the paths from somewhere else. So up here in the top corner, you will find the ellipse tool. So I will double click that. And let's size this down. I will also parent it to, let's work on the left hip. So I'm going to parent it to the left hip and change the position. Let's see. Hit P to pull up the position, change that to 50 and 50. That will put it directly in the center of that null that we parented it to. And then I still got to change the scale a little bit more. So ellipse path, and then down till it's just inside that. Obviously, the closer it is, the better, because we're basically building the ball and socket joint here. So if the hip has the ball, then this would be kind of like the socket. So once we are happy with that size, which I'm pretty happy with that, we will right click on ellipse path here and convert to Bezier path. So now we have the ability to edit this. I will set a keyframe right here in the center. Just right there. And let me bring in a ruler for the top of the waist where that will be. And then we're going to edit this path a little bit. So I'll grab the pen tool up here. You can use the hotkey G to get that. I'm just going to give myself an additional point. And I'll also bring in the center. This doesn't need to be exact. I just need to make sure that I'm on the other side of the center line. And I'm going to bring that all the way up to the top, pull this over here, and we're just kind of going to make a really rough little shape. The main thing I don't want to do is touch the point on the outside. I want to keep that right where that is. And we'll just leave that down there. I'm going to kind of shape out this hip a little bit. That's fine, just like that. All right. Going to unparent that from the hip because I want it to be independent from that. And let's hit Control-Alt-Home. So that will move the anchor point just to the center of our shape that we've made here. So we have a keyframe for the path, and let's also select the shape layer, hit P, and then make a keyframe for the position. And then let's also practice good organization and name this. So we will name it Geom for geometry. And we will call this left hip, left L_hip. And then we will move to the left, underneath the left asterisk, and we are going to make that keyframe. So let me slide this over here, change it to -150, and I'm actually going to just keyframe this animation again so we can scrub through the timeline and see how the rig will move. So over here on the right, we will change it to 150. So when we scrub, we get that animation. And let's add keyframes for this hip in that position. So I will make keyframes, and let's just kind of change the position over a little bit, and it's looking pretty good. So let's just reshape that. So A little bit of a shape change back there. Let's move that kind of to the center. And then again, your character design is going to dictate how this looks. This is just roughly the side, what it will look like. And so now we'll see that in motion just because it's moving on it's independent of that slider right now. They're just moving at the same linear rate. So that'll give us an idea of what it'll kind of look like. And it looks like I've already messed that up somehow. Probably when I changed the position, I might have messed that up. So let me just adjust for that. There we go. This is why it's important to see things in motion and check your rig as you're building it, because it's really easy to mess things up, which we don't want to do. And then we will do its final click. So I'll change the position again. Make a keyframe for the path. You can edit the path after you've made a keyframe, and then we will just adjust. I'm not being all that accurate right now. I would probably be a lot more concerned about the accuracy of this in an actual rig, but since it's just for this tutorial, I just need to show you kind of roughly the process. And there you go. We have one side of the hip. So that's pretty cool. And then because we were pretty mathematical about the way that we started this, where we had the hips in the same position off center, we can actually duplicate this and get really messy with that. So actually, let me change that again. So we duplicated it. I will bring in a new null, which will be right in the center. I will parent it to that null, and then I will flip that by going -100. And now I can delete that. And so it's not exact, of course, but I can switch these keyframes, the left and the right. And now we get a much better look. The last thing we may want to do is add the center of gravity. So over here in DuIK, we can hit the controller tab, and let's bring in a controller. And this will be our center of gravity. And then what we're going to do is grab the hip, which we should rename this. So this was the copy, so we will just call this the right hip. Grab both of those. We will also, while holding the control key, we can select more layers. We will grab the hips. We will parent those to this null, which we will call C for controller, and then we will call it COG for center of gravity. So that is our center of gravity controller. Change that to purple. Then we can get some nice movement. This is of course just using whatever IK rig. And this becomes our position controller. And then let's also connect this. Let's see, where's that at? We will connect this slider up here to the center of gravity. So just parent it to that. Lock it, Shy Guy everything. And so now when we move the center of gravity controller around, that controller will follow it. And we haven't hooked up the hips to that yet, but everything's parented correctly. So let's do that now. If we go back over to rigging, hit the little circle for the connector. Okay, a little hard to hit. We need to select our slider again and just make sure that that's what we're referencing. So select the slider knob, hit position. We're just making sure this is just selecting that property. As you can see, there's still our -150 and our +150. So now we can grab the keyframes we just made for the hips and connect to properties. So now when we grab that knob, it will move. Let's get rid of those keyframes on its position. And we have basically made our hip twist controller. You can get a little bit more fancy with it and do the same thing with the hips like we did with the legs, where you duplicate that and then have them turn on and off. Not necessary, just depends on what you want to do, what you want to get away with your rig. And you'll want to lock all your geometry, and we can even just shy guide those. And then this becomes our control, and that is it. So I hope you had a lot of fun following along with me. If you'd like to see more content, be sure to like and subscribe down below. That really helps me out. I'm most active on Instagram. I share process and tutorials over there, along with my own work. I can be found at speedlag. Finally, if you use any technique from this video, please shout me out. I'd love to see what you put together. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.